Erev Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Maaser Sheni. We're up to Perek Bet Mishnah Dalid. Today's Mishnayot should be Le'ilun Nishmat Neria ben Svetlana Aranbayev and Eliyahu ben Burcha Israelov Menuchatam Began Eden Amen. Today's Mishnah is going to discuss how vetch, which is a type of plant that is teruma, is treated more leniently than vetch that is Maaser Sheni. Like we mentioned in Mishnah 2, the Mishnah says, Karshine Maaser Sheni ye'achlu tzimchonim. Vetch that is Maaser Sheni must be eaten when its stalks are young and moist, because vetch, like fenugreek that we mentioned in Mishnah number 3, turns hard and inedible as it ripens. Since it is forbidden to cause Maaser Sheni to go to waste, a person must eat vetch before it becomes inedible, but vetch that is terumado may be kept until it hardens, and the reasoning is the same as we gave for fenugreek in yesterday's Mishnah, that since vetch and fenugreek that is teruma may be fed to animals, therefore it can be kept until it dries, because they can then be fed to animals and will not go to waste. Right? Because once vetch or fenugreek dry, it's only ra'ui, it's only fit for animal feed. The Mishnah now discusses two more halachot that apply to vetch that is Maaser Sheni, and these are matters which vetch Maaser Sheni is different from other Maaser Sheni produce. The Mishnah says, "V'nichnasin Yerushalayim yotzin." Maaser Sheni vetch may be brought into Yerushalayim and then taken out of the city, in contrast to other Maaser Sheni produce that may never be taken out of Yerushalayim once it is brought in. And the Mefarshim explain, like fenugreek, vetch is primarily used for animal feed and therefore should not really be subject to Maaser Sheni. But since some people do eat the young stalks, it is obligated in Maaser Sheni midrabanan by rabbinic law. However, its laws are not as stringent as those of other forms of Maaser Sheni. Therefore, while in general Maaser Sheni may not be taken out of Yerushalayim once it is brought in, like we will learn in chapter 3, Mishnah 5, vetch may be removed from Yerushalayim if it can be prepared more easily outside of Yerushalayim. However, the Mefarshim do say it must be brought back to Yerushalayim to be eaten. Now, the next halakha involves Maaser Sheni that became tameh. Generally, if Maaser Sheni becomes tameh, it may be redeemed for money, which takes on its sanctity, like we will see in chapter 3, Mishnah 9. The halakha is different though for vetch that is Maaser Sheni. Nitmeu, if Maaser Sheni vetch became tameh, Rabbi Tarfon says that it may not be redeemed, and the Mefarshim added that the Mishnah just says Rabbi Tarfon Omer itchaleku leisot. It should be divided into small portions, but the Mefarshim add that Rabbi Tarfon says that it may not be redeemed, because Rabbi Tarfon is concerned that if the vetch is redeemed, it will be fed to animals, since that's how vetch is usually used. And since we have a principle that sacred items may not be redeemed if they will then be fed to animals, like we learned in Teruma, chapter 6, Mishnah 5, and we're going to see in here, chapter 3, Mishnah 11, Rabbi Tarfon forbids redeeming this vetch. And therefore, Rabbi Tarfon says, itchalku leisot, it should be divided into smaller portions, which should be mixed together with larger ta'om Maaser Sheni doughs, so that in each dough, the small amount of vetch will be nullified by the larger amount of ta'om Maaser Sheni, which is an application of the halachic principle known as bitul berov, nullification by the majority, which teaches that when two substances are mixed, the majority substance nullifies the minority one. So based on this, the small amount of tameh vetch is nullified by the larger amount of ta'ol vetch, and the mixture may be eaten. Now the Rav does tell us that tameh vetch must be divided into portions smaller than the size of an egg, a kabetza, because anything larger than that will transmit its tumah to the food that it touches, and the whole mixture will become tameh. But food smaller than an egg, smaller than a kabetza, does not transmit tumah to other food, so it would have to be made smaller than that. V'chachamim omrim, but the sages disagree. They say yipadu, the vetch may be redeemed, just as with any Maaser Sheni that becomes tameh, because according to the Chachamim, the Mefarshim explain, the prohibition against redeeming sacred items to feed them to animals applies only to food usually eaten by people. But vetch is generally fed to animals, and therefore, although it may not be fed to animals while it has Maaser Sheni sanctity, it may be redeemed and then fed to animals. And the Rav tells us, V'alacha kechachamim, the halacha follows the opinion of the sages. The Mishnah now discusses vetch that is teruma. Like we mentioned in the previous Mishnah, a person is generally required to wash his hands before handling teruma. But there's a machloket, a disagreement. There's a disagreement whether this requirement applies to vetch, which, like fenugreek, has more lenient laws than ordinary terumah. Because again, since vetch is primarily used as animal feed, its requirement in terumah is only midrabanan by rabbinic law and is therefore treated more leniently than other forms of terumah. So the Mishnah is going to speak about a machloket, whether you have to wash your hands before handling vetch, which is terumah. The Mishnah says v'shel terumah, regarding vetch that is terumah. Bet Shammai amrim, Bet Shammai say, shorin v'shafin b'tahara, when we soak such vetch or rub it on the skin, we must do so in a state of purity, meaning a person must wash his hands before touching it, just as for ordinary terumah, uma'achilin b'tumah, but when we feed vetch to animals, we may do so in a state of tumah, meaning a person doesn't have to wash his hands first, because although vetch does not have the same stringencies as ordinary terumah, the rabbis decreed according to Bet Shammai that when a person uses it for himself, he may not touch it with unwashed hands, so that people will remember that it is terumah and no non-Kohen will eat it. Now in general, vetch is used in two ways. Number one, a person soaks it to soften it and then rubs it on his skin, or he feeds it to an animal. Now, although the young stalks can be eaten by people, like the Mishnah said earlier, that was not commonly done. It was usually soaked and then to soften it and then rubs it on the skin, or he feeds it to an animal. Now, the Chachamim decreed that before a person uses it for himself, namely before he soaks it or rubs it, he must wash his hands. That's enough of a reminder that it is terumah. When feeding it to the animal, however, the hands don't have to be washed. Now, the Mishnah quotes Bet Hillel's opinion now, which is based on the principle that food cannot become tameh unless it is first huchshar l'tumah, prepared for tumah by becoming wet. To Bet Hillel Omein, Bet Hillel say, shorin b'tahara, when we soak vetch, our hands must be tahor. V'shafin uma'achinin b'tumah, but when we rub vetch on the skin or feed it to an animal in a state of tumah, right? But we may rub vetch on the skin or feed it to an animal in a state of tumah, because Mefarshim explain according to Bet Hillel, only when a person soaks vetch must he wash his hands, because soaking vetch with unwashed hands causes two things at once to happen. It prepares the vetch to become tameh by wetting it, and it makes the vetch tameh by bringing it into contact with unwashed hands. This the Chachamim forbade as a reminder that this vetch is tumah. But when it's used in other ways, the hands may be unwashed, because Bet Hillel holds that this one restriction is enough of a reminder. Shammai Omer, Shammai says, is another opinion, a person may handle vetch with unwashed hands, ye'achlut sarid, but the vetch should be fed to animals only when it is dry, because according to Shammai, a person may not use vetch in a way that it is obvious that he's making it tameh, since produce can become tameh once it's wet. If a person uses wet vetch with unwashed hands, it will be clear that he's making it tameh. This is forbidden. But if the vetch is dry, though, it's not obvious that he's making it tameh, and the rabbis didn't require him to wash his hands. And the Mefarshim explain the vetch will still become tameh if it had once become wet. However, someone who sees a person using dry vetch doesn't know whether it had ever been wet or not. Since it's not obvious that he's making the vetch wet, the tameh, he does not have to wash his hands first. So we had three opinions here. We had Bet Shammai who said we can, when we soak or rub it on the skin, we have to do it in a state of purity, wash your hands before. But when you feed it to the animals, you can do it in a state of tumah. You don't have to wash your hands. Bet Hillel said when we soak, our hands must be tahor, but when we rub or feed it to animals, it could be in a state of tumah. And Shammai says that the vetch should be fed to animals only when it's dry, because if it would become wet, then it would become tameh. Now, a person may handle, according to Shammai, vetch with unwashed hands, but the actual vetch should be dry when fed to the animals, so that because if it were ever wet and your hands are not washed, it would make it tameh. Rabbi Akiva says, Kol ma'asen b'tumah, anything that is done with vetch may be done when a person is tameh, because the Chachamim made no decrees requiring a person to wash his hands before handling vetch. And the Rav says, the halakha does not follow the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. And that is in Rabotai Mishnah Daled. Mishnah now teaches what should be done if Maaser Sheni coins become mixed up with ordinary coins. Me'ot chulin u'me'ot Maaser Sheni shenitpazeru. Chulin coins and similar looking Maaser Sheni coins were scattered, and now we cannot tell which coins are which. If someone picks up the coins one by one, whichever coins he picked up first, he picked up for Maaser Sheni, meaning the first coins he collects are treated as Maaser Sheni, until he finishes collecting the number of coins that belong to Maaser Sheni, V'ashar Chulin, and the rest of the coins are then treated as Chulin, and the Mefarshim explain, for example, if there were 100 Maaser Sheni coins and 100 Chulin coins, the first 100 coins he picks up are Maaser Sheni and the rest are Chulin. This way, if a few coins will be lost at the end, the loss will be a loss of Chulin and not of Maaser Sheni. Now, since he cannot be sure that the first 100 coins he collects are truly Maaser Sheni, he makes the following stipulation after he collects 100 coins. If all these coins are Maaser Sheni, then all is well. If not, let the sanctity of all the Maaser Sheni coins still on the floor be transferred to any Chulin coins that I've collected. Through this Tanai, this declaration, this stipulation, all the coins he picked up take on a definite Maaser Sheni sanctity, and the rest of the coins are Chulin, as the Rab explains to us. Im balal v'chafan, however, if the coins fell in a jumble and he scooped up a handful at a time rather than one by one, the handful of coins are treated lefi cheshbon, by proportion. For example, if 2/3 of the coins were Maaser Sheni and 1/3 were Chulin, 2/3 of the coins in each handful are treated as Maaser Sheni and 1/3 as Chulin. And the Mefarshim explain in the Mishnah's previous case, where a person picked up the coin one by one, we consider each coin as it is picked up. We look at each coin that you pick up. Each coin has an even chance of being one of the Maaser Sheni coins. Therefore, it's possible to say that the first coins picked up are all Maaser Sheni. Since that's possible, the rabbis ruled that we should consider it as such in order to save Maaser Sheni from a possible loss of losing some coins at the end, although the person has to still make the declaration in order to make sure they're all Maaser Sheni. But in this case, though, where he picks up a handful of coins, it's unreasonable to say that the whole handful is Maaser Sheni. So accordingly, we assume that some are Maaser Sheni and some are Chulin, based on the proportion of Maaser Sheni and Chulin in the original mixture. In addition, since we cannot be certain that the coins he designates as Maaser Sheni are in fact those of Maaser Sheni, he must also make the declaration that we said here in order to transfer the Maaser Sheni sanctity to those coins that he's considering as Maaser Sheni. And that is Enach B'Tayv today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.